Our guest speaker today is a good friend and colleague of mine. The introduction will be brief. Chris is a retiring type. He's a retired gynaecologist, retired obstetrician, and a retired group captain in the Air Force Reserve. That's all he wanted me to say. Chris Verco, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank your President for kindly inviting me to speak today. Your 100th anniversary is a wonderful achievement and many more to come, one hopes. Now, my talk today is not going to be about the East India Company. I just thought you'd be interested to see the flag. I just need to find the thing. When I was invited to speak in January, I offered two topics for presentation, neither of which your President really wanted. So he asked me to speak about the Australian Indian armies at Gallipoli, something about which I know much more than I did in January now. And the interesting part to it is that not much was known in India about the Indians at Gallipoli, or indeed during World War I. And recent interest has from India has generated a series of books, one of which have been written by the Australian Peter Stanley, and so I've referred to him almost exclusively throughout. My talk is going to have some introductory comments, which I might just foreshorten a little bit so I can get on to the nitty-gritty. The lead up to World War I, the Indian Army, the concept of a warrior class led by Englishmen, the notion of Indian artillery. I might shorten the utility of artillery a bit, but then into the 18th of March 1915 naval attack on Turkey, the landings on the 25th of April, the Indian Mountain Artillery, the Transport Corps, health and sanitary staff, and by and large we all learnt a lot from the Indians with regard to this. Then for some fun, the Patiala Regiment, pay and medals, burial rites, and then Ian Hamilton, the Commander-in-Chief's summary. Just to put it in perspective, in World War I, the Indians lost 74,000 troops, Australians 61, or just under 62,000, not the 215,000 that was actually announced in the Daily Mail in London yesterday. But in the Dardanelles campaign, the Gallipoli campaign, there were 1,600 Indian deaths and just over 8,000 Australian deaths. To put that in perspective, that's every male child born in South Australia in 2020. So you consider the whole lot dying in one short campaign. Now, for those of you who want to pay attention to something else during lunch, this is the summary. The Australian Indian troops at Gallipoli got on extremely well. Australians admired the professionalism, courage, their food and their company. So let's see if we can pack something around that. One of the things I want to emphasise is the perception in the Western world of the Ottomans were on their knees. We'll start in 1799 because why, for heaven's sake, not? The Ottoman Empire was meant to be failing. Napoleon's troops in Egypt led an army up the eastern coast of the Mediterranean with the intention of taking Constantinople, as it was then, Istanbul today. They were stopped by the Royal Navy, who resupplied the Arabs at Acre. At much the same time, the Duke of Wellington was with the British army in southern India in the 4th Anglo-Mysore War, where Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, who'd aligned himself with the French, was defeated at Seringhapatna. Shortly afterwards, Wellington, who's now been promoted to Major General, under the Governor-Generalship of his brother, Lord Mornington, initiates the 3rd Anglo-Maratha War, which takes on the Maratha Confederacy in India and claims a large slab of central India, the Deccan, the area around Delhi, and the Punjab for Britain. In 1853, the Ottoman weakness prompts the Russians to take on, I'll show this in a slide in a minute, to take on the Ottoman Empire for two reasons. Religious reasons, so they have a direct route for the the Orthodox Church to get from Russia to Jerusalem, but secondly, to give the Russians a warm water port. And it's Ottoman weakness that prompts the Russians to do this. The Tsar, Nicholas I, talks about the sick man of Europe, and the sick man of Europe was the Ottoman Empire. The aim is actually precisely the opposite of the Gallipoli campaign. Gallipoli campaign was aimed at resupplying the Russians from the Mediterranean. The Russian War of 1853 was to stop the Russians getting access to the Mediterranean through the Black Sea. Shortly afterwards, the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny, and then almost immediately superimposed with the Sixth Anglo-Maratha War. So the Sepoy Mutiny starts in Meerut, descends to Delhi, and occupies that central area of the Punjab, whereas the Anglo-Maratha War takes place in Cawnpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi. The Government of India Act, the British government take over India in 1858. Now, there are consequences to this, and the consequences are that no Indian brigade is completely, has Indian troops, usually 3 battalions of Indian troops and 1 battalion of English troops, and the Indians never had heavy artillery again until 1947. Germany was formed after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. They were militaristic, wished to, a bit like the Russians in 1853, wished to have their own empire, and there was a bit of cultural Darwinism going on. And then by the time you get to 1914, this is shortening a century of history, of course, the Kaiser Tsar and the English king are all first cousins. They're all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria had died in the arms of Kaiser Bill at Windsor Castle. The Kaiser was unpredictable, irascible, and felt that he determined German foreign policy. Now, just to point out some of those things, this is very interesting that Steve should show his picture of the Black Sea. The British had got through because it was the British, French, and Ottoman Empire that were taking on the Russians. So they got through and concentrated around here at a place called Varna. The Russians then retreated from up on the Danube. The Russians having retreated, the British thought, what should we do next? So they decided to go and flatten Sevastopol, which is in the Crimea. I'm sorry, I'm not quite tall enough. So the British and French armies land in Calamita Bay, about 12 miles north of Sevastopol. The British planned to fight their way ashore, which meant they were quite slow in lining up on the Crimean shore. The French sort of selected a few restaurants and went and did a deal with the locals. So they landed unopposed, and the British took a while to get there. And then, of course, the Crimean campaign. The real Russian war was fought in the Baltic. That's where the Russians got creamed. And as you probably know, as a consequence, the Russians lost Alaska. World War I, just a very brief potted history of that. On the 28th of June, so 1914 was a beautiful year apparently. On the 28th of June, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia. The Austrians blamed the Serbians, couldn't give a toss about Franz Ferdinand, and so they were lining up to teach the Serbians a lesson. The big mistake was the Bettmann-Hollweg letter, which offered the Austrians support from Germany no matter what Austria did. So that's a bit like having Arnold Schwarzenegger standing behind you as you go down the beach kicking sand in people's face. The Austrians issue an ultimatum to the Serbs. The Russians start to mobilise. So this is late in July 1914. Serbia agrees to most of the things, but the Austrians are not happy with that, so they declare war on Serbia on the 28th of July. 1st of August, Germany declares war on Russia. The French-Russian pact comes into operation. Germany declares war on France and enters Belgium. The British Empire and Belgium have a pact. The British issue an ultimatum to Germany. So war with Germany starts at 11 p.m. on the 4th of August 1914, and of course we're at war the next day. The Germans have 5 armies that descend across France, and it's really the 4 most eastern armies all concentrate in the Marne Valley to the east of Paris. It's the army on the right that's perhaps the most interesting, the army that's on the western side commanded by von Kluck, and von Kluck was meant to pass south of Paris, surrounding Paris, and the war would have all been over by the end of August 1914. Of course, being an independent thinker, he decides to cross in front of Paris to join the other armies in the Marne Valley, and as a consequence, the Germans then get beaten in the Marne Valley and pushed back. The trenches are formed, and the trench warfare lasts then for the next 4 years. On the eastern side, the Russians get creamed. They have two armies, and the southernmost one gets creamed. The one that's actually attacking Austria gets creamed by the Germans, and the Russians then cease to be particularly useful. So there's a desire with trenches running across Europe and the Russians needing to have some support. There's a desire to help them, and the way in which to help them is in the Dardanelles campaign. So the target is Constantinople. So where would you land if you were going to attack Constantinople? I know, why not do it down here? Now the real challenge was to get through this little bit, the Narrows, get the Navy into the Sea of Marmara, and then obviously shell the Turks until the Turks surrender. Not perhaps the most original plan. You think you might attack somewhere further up, but no, that's where they did. So the Navy are the first ones to launch an attack on the 18th of March. They run into minefields and it sinks a large number of French and British ships. First time that air power was really particularly useful because the Ottomans had two German planes. They took off and realised that the boats coming didn't have any transports, and so all they had to do is to withstand a naval attack. Something very quickly was planned, and that was the landings at the end of the Gallipoli Peninsula, Cape Helles, on the 25th of April. So you realise that it was a very short planning time, and of course with planning time like that, nothing was properly planned at all. The Indian Army in 1914, there were 200,000 troops from a population of 300 million. Now this is the India that included at that stage Pakistan. The Indian Army was made up of professional, experienced soldiers. There was the concept of a warrior class in India, and it didn't include everyone. It included the Gurkhas, who are coming from Nepal, the Sikhs and the Punjabis, a mixture of religions, and then there were some armies that came from princely states, for example, Patiala. And I'll talk about that later because there's some interesting bits. And as you might imagine, they had different religions, customs, diets and language. And to put an army together with these people was actually quite difficult. It was felt that they had to be led by English officers. The most senior Indian officer was junior to the most junior English lieutenant. The English officers were expected to learn the language of their troops. And an Indian brigade, as I've already said, always had a British battalion in the middle, and there were always loyalty concerns. They didn't have their own artillery, and by and large they had loyalty to their unit, but not necessarily a cohesive loyalty. So for example, if one Gurkha regiment had worked out how to use the Vickers machine gun, they didn't share that information with any of the other parts of the Indian Army. They rather retained those, a bit like obstetric forceps, which remained a secret in one family for over 100 years. These people came, I'm sorry, I have to turn my back, but Nepal, New Delhi, Lahore and Karachi, just to identify some key places. So by and large, they're coming from this sort of area around here. Up into what is now in Pakistan. So the mutiny starts here at Meerut, just out of New Delhi, and then you've got Cawnpur, Jhansi, Gwalior and Agra. There were 5 Indian Army Expeditionary Forces deployed by order of the Viceroy. So the government didn't make any decision, it was the government in England that made the decision and the Viceroy implemented it. There were Indian troops in France in October 1914 and they were defending Antwerp. By the end of 1914, there were 2 Indian divisions. So divisions about 12,000, 10 to 12,000 in very round figures. So there were 25,000, let's say, Indian troops in France before the end of 1914. Indian troops had been dispatched to East Africa and to Mesopotamia, where they were ultimately to get defeated by the Turks, to Egypt, particularly along the Suez Canal, and from that Group E emerged Group G, which were the troops who served at Gallipoli. One of the things that's a great conundrum is why the British didn't have Indian troops land at ANZAC. Some landed at Cape Helles, but they didn't get to ANZAC until August 1915. And given that Sir Ian Hamilton, the overall Commander-in-Chief, and General Birdwood, the Commander of the Australian Corps, both had served in India and knew the value of Indian fighting soldiers who had fought in territory very, very similar to the territory around Gallipoli, they were still very concerned that these people didn't actually call up for Indian troops and land them. First contact is here with potential contacts with South Australians, and I claim an association. The Turks attacked the Suez Canal, and a South Australian medical unit, an element of the 1st Australian Stationary Hospital, was sent to here at Ismailia. And that included, for those of you who'd like these names, led by somebody called Powell. Major Henry Newland, later Sir Henry Newland, was the major, and the captain was my grandfather. Their first patient was a pregnant woman who'd come off a boat in the Suez Canal, and perhaps that destined my career. I doubt it. Okay, so when we get to the landings are twofold. There are landings here, or around here, French, Australians. There are landings of the British, and then 12 miles north, at this feature called Gallipoli, the ANZAC Corps land at ANZAC Cove. And you can see it sort of, that's from a book, but the same sort of message. On the 25th of April, the ANZAC Corps land, so we're landing 2 divisions, but also with them the Indian Mountain Artillery. So there were two mountain artillery units. They each had 6 guns. And the Indian Supply and Transport Corps. 650 Indians landed on the 25th of April. The Indians and Australians formed a very positive relationship in Egypt and in the Suez Canal and in Mudros Harbour. So they actually were quite fond of each other. The Indian Mountain Artillery, they had 6 10-pound guns each and 300 mules. The mules had been taught to move silently, and each gun was carried by 4 mules. The Jacobs Battery were in action around noon on the 25th of April. Kohat Battery landed about dusk and were in action later. Kohat Battery on the 19th of May fired 600 rounds in counter-battery fire, so they were really, by the end of the campaign, had largely blown out the barrels of their guns. Artillery, most of World War I was an artillery war, and you had a number of options with artillery. You had round shot, shells, shrapnel and canister shot, limited howitzers with a much higher trajectory at Gallipoli. The Australians invented a mortar because there were very few mortar bombs available, and that Garland mortar fired a jam tin bomb, and then what they refer to bombs, which we would interpret today, is hand grenades. Guns were surveyed into position, and there was a forward artillery officer who selected the targets and used a field telephone to adjust fire. When the British officers had been killed from these units, by and large Australians could take over, provided their commands were absolutely bog-standard commands that the British had used, and so that the Indian gunners could actually interpret what's going on. Now, the problem with the guns that we had there was they had a very flat trajectory. The Turks had their artillery on the reverse slope, so it was very hard to hit them unless you had something that had a very high trajectory, and we really didn't have much of that, certainly not to start off with. Supply and Transport Corps, mainly Muslim, Many had come back from France, so they'd already served in France. The mules were from Argentina, China, USA, Cyprus and India. They were organised into 23 different mule units, and they had 150 mule ammunition transport carts. The water supply at ANZAC limited them to 600, and from time to time they lost a large number of mules. At one stage, 220 were lost in 3 days. By the start of autumn, there were 2,000 mules there. Now, Simpson, it always is interesting to me, did he have a donkey or a mule? I think he had a donkey. He called his donkeys Murphy. He had a series of them, and they all got shot from under him. And then he was killed in that big Turkish counter-attack on the 19th of May. And the Indians, he spent a lot of time in the Indian lines, and the Indians called him Murphy and treasured his last donkey. The Maharaja of Patiala was a remarkable character. He had a small army of about 2 companies in strength. He had been a very good polo player. He had a fleet of Rolls-Royce cars, 365 wives, of whom 10 were principal wives. His army had 3 major generals, and ultimately, throughout the war, 28,000 of his people served overseas, so a very considerable contribution. Although when he went with the troops to Egypt, he got sick and didn't get past Aden. He had an annual display of his virility where he appeared in front of his people, naked in a state of excitement and highly decorated to persuade them that he was still a good chap. He encouraged his people to join the join the forces under his team's command, and he felt that for recruits it would secure for themselves a lifelong happiness. Should the idea of being killed trouble the heart of a weak-minded person, he should chase the unmanly idea away by remembering that hundreds of thousands of our people have met their death of plague, cholera and other terrible disease. Can anyone say that death on the field of battle is worse than death by horrible diseases? Think that one through. The Indians had their own system of decorations. As one of my colleagues said, the 2 things that are most important in the military are pay and medals. The Indians had their own Order of Merit, which was supplanted by, there were 3 levels of it, but the top level was supplanted by the Victoria Cross. They had a Distinguished Service Medal and Indian Distinguished Conduct Medal. By and large, the process of awarding medals was slow. The Indian command was in Shimla as it is now, in India, and it took a while for people who'd performed, given exemplary service to get recognised. None of them were awarded a Victoria Cross at Gallipoli, but nonetheless, most of them got the standard service medals, which Jeff Tate is wearing at the moment, of a family member, the 14-15 Star, the Victory Medal and the British War Medal. Pay was much less, and the Transport Corps were not considered soldiers, so they weren't far behind the front line. They were taking stuff up every day. So if they got shot, they got remembered, but if they didn't get shot, they didn't get paid as much as the actual soldiers. Funeral rites, I've just put that there because Muslims really need to be buried on the day on which they die, whereas Sikhs and Hindus require cremation, and so wood and oil was shipped into Gallipoli for that purpose. After the war, as they were going through a large number of skeletons at Gallipoli, it was hard to tell who was who, so they divided them in the usual military fashion. That pile are Hindu and need to be burnt, and that pile are Muslim and need to be buried, and that's exactly what happened. Most of the Indians were vegetarian. The Australians appreciated curry for their bully beef, and they really enjoyed roti and chapatis, and the Indians were invariably generous with tea and snacks. We had a lot of jam, and apparently if you got a spoonful of jam out of a tin, by and large it was covered by flies by the time it got to your mouth. So something that wasn't quite so sickly sweet was a joy. Now finally, and this is my last slide, those of you who've been watching The Time assiduously, Sir Ian Hamilton, the ultimate commander-in-chief, especially noted that it's ANZAC true. There was a doubt as to how the Australians with the White Australia policy would cope with people who were not acceptable to be immigrants into Australia. And his summary was that the Australians and Indians, we get on capitally with the Indian rank and file and are genuinely fond of them. In no campaign I have yet served in have I seen Indians so well treated, so well fed, or so happy. So look, I hope that's interesting, and thank you very much for your attention. And Rajiv, thank you very much for inviting me.
Right, so we had it from the press. We've got time for one question. No, that's Milos. Right, in that case, don't go away. On with the show. So you can guarantee one thing with Chris Verco, it's never going to be what you expected, which is a good thing. So Chris, on behalf of the club, I'd like to present you with our Certificate of Appreciation. And this bear, I'm still not quite sure what the utility of it is, but nevertheless, you get one. Thank you very much. Thank you.